Networker Live, which is a video series produced by the Psychotherapy Networker magazine. And my name is Marion Sandmeyer. I am the features editor of the magazine. And I'm extremely pleased to be talking today with Mary Pipher, who is a psychologist and the author of 11 books, including her brand new memoir, which is called A Life in Light, Meditations on Impermanence. And I want to show this book because it's such a beautiful cover and even more beautiful inside, but you can sort of see it with different colors. A Life in Light. And for another show and tell, I want to let you guys know that the current issue of the Psychotherapy Networker, which is the July-August issue, has a review of Mary's book that I was privileged to write. And you can get more information about her book at that review. And there are many, many other great pieces in this issue. So also, for those of you who are not yet subscribers to the Networker, if you're interested, at the end of this conversation, you can go to www.psychotherapynetworker.org/Pipher, and that's going to be at the bottom of your screen. So now let's get to the star of the show. Mary, welcome. Welcome to Networker Live.
Thank you so much. It's always fun for me to work with the Networker. I've been working with the Networker since 1994. Wow. So it's great. It's great.
Oh, I'm very glad. I'm very glad you're on our team. I'd like to just do a bit of introduction before we start our conversation, and that is to say that Mary has written 4 New York Times bestseller books, including the groundbreaking Reviving Ophelia, Saving the Selves of Adolescent Girls, which is truly iconic and still really important in terms of helping teenage girls find their voices. And in 2019, Mary was the recipient of the Networker Lifetime Achievement Award for her work in writing and other ways that she promotes an awareness of the intersection of emotional health and sociocultural issues. And moreover, I think many of you might not know, she is also a very active community organizer for many issues, trying to make real some of the problems that she writes about and advocates for. So with that intro, Mary, I would like to just get into the issues of your new book, your memoir. And I'm curious, as a psychologist and as you, I know you've always been deeply interested in other people's stories and what they're thinking and feeling, and you remain that way. I talked to you recently, and I wonder. I'm very curious about what prompted you at this point in your life to turn inward and write a memoir.
Yeah, well, the shortest answer I can give to that is the pandemic. I hadn't planned to write another book. My last book, by the way, I wrote with my daughter, and it was a 25th year edition and update of Reviving Ophelia. And that was about as hard as writing a whole new book, because we took out a lot of the no longer relevant information and interviewed a whole new set of girls. And so that was my last book, and I was pretty much done. I felt like I had a lot of other interests, including activism in my own community, and didn't necessarily need to write another book. But then the pandemic came, and with it came, in my case, loneliness and despair and a sense of emptiness. So many of the activities I'd been engaged with weren't possible. I couldn't see my daughter and her family who lived in Canada and the border was closed. I couldn't see my son's family because of COVID. And I realized I needed something to help me be resilient and to deal with my own despair. And that whatever I could figure out that might be of use to me might be of use to other people. So I started writing about light. And I'm always someone who pays a great deal of attention to light. My first memory is of being a baby and lying on a blanket and looking up uh, at the dappled light through the leaves of a tree in my grandmother's front yard. And I didn't encode this verbally, it was before I was verbal, but I have that memory of those sparkling lights and how beautiful they were. Mm. And so as I look through my own life, I realized that I have probably about the ordinary amount of darkness and shadow in my life, but that there's a constant theme in my own experience of looking for light and figuring out ways to bring light in with darkness, which is, of course, both literal but also metaphorical in terms of resilience and coping skills. So I just enjoyed this book tremendously. I was able with this book to remember the extraordinary love of my grandparents for me, especially one grandmother. This particular grandmother, I say in the book, loved me into existence because she is really the first person who organized at least part of her life around making me happy and understanding me and giving me ideas to consider about myself and about the way I wanted to be in the future. And for example, one story I've told about my grandmother many times is that she asked me to help her do dishes. She'd have these big dinners with my cousin, my Aunt Agnes family, and my mom, and our family of 4 children, and my dad. And then she'd say, "Now, Mary, I want you to help me do dishes." And then when we got in there, I'd say, "Well, let's do these dishes really slow," because she would talk to me as we did dishes. And it was a wonderful conversation every time. So I wrote about her and my aunts and my parents, who were very complicated people. And then I continued to write. Most of the book is early experience up through college, and then later experience. And then there's what I call the mushy middle, where I just seem to have about 45 years that I worked and raised kids and sort of did stuff. And I don't write much about it. I don't have too many memories about it. It's not the vivid memories with emotional heft. So this book is a collection of stories about my relationship to both kinds of light, metaphorical and literal.
Right. It's really interesting that your first memory is of dappled light, which combines light and shadow.
Yes.
Yeah, it's very poignant. So you talked a bit just now about your early life and your wonderful grandmother, who everyone should have, that person. And then you do talk somewhat about your college years, which I found really interesting. Well, when you were in your late teens, or maybe you were 20, you moved from Kansas to San Francisco. And then a little later, you enrolled at Berkeley and graduated from there. And I was struck by the fact that you were there in the midst of it all in the late 60s. And you call it a feast for the senses there. Mm. And I just wonder, although it was complicated there as well, it was a feast and there were some challenges, I think. And I wonder what your felt experience of that place at that time was, and if you felt it changed you in any ways.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because from my point of view, one of the things I've always had the knack for is being in the center of the universe. And this is not when I was a girl and had no control. But for example, when I was first at University of Kansas at 17, it's when the civil rights marches were going on in Kansas City. and the beginning of the anti-war movement. And there was a professor there who had all the beat poets come through and read for the English department. And Kansas City at that moment seemed the center of the universe. Mm-hmm. Then, of course, Berkeley in the late 60s and the Bay Area was an amazing place. My brother lived in San Francisco in a commune, and I was in quite a bit in the San Francisco. I worked at Dunkin' Donuts on Market Street. And oh my gosh, that city was amazing. They had North Beach and City Lights book. They had Golden Gate Park with the Diggers and all the great music of the late 60s that came through San Francisco. I mean, Janis Joplin and Sam Cooke was out there, and Otis Redding was out there quite a bit, and the Chambers Brothers. Van Morrison came in his early days. It was really, and of course, the food and the light is amazing in San Francisco. Just most beautiful oyster-colored skies and the fog rolling in and all the flowers and the smells. And I loved Berkeley. I majored in cultural anthropology. It was a wonderful department. And Telegraph Avenue was just full of one extraordinary experience after another. I loved the coffee houses and the bookstores. And I was part of the group that started People's Park, which was really full of art and theater and poetry readings and children in little wading pools with flowers around their necks. I mean, it was just a gorgeous place. I was part of the protests when the University of California and the police came in and tore down the park. So it was a wonderful experience in many ways. I left the Bay Area after I graduated from Berkeley because, first of all, I couldn't really find a place for myself there. I couldn't afford to stay and go to graduate school, even though I think I could have if I had the money. And the city was changing by late 69. It was turning into a harder place with more drugs. It was the time when there were starting to be groups that were arming for a revolution. And I just that wasn't the kind of life I wanted to live. It changed me in many ways. It introduced me to the women's movement, the gay rights movement, the indigenous peoples movement, the green movement. It was just an extraordinary introduction to almost all the great activist movements of the last century. But it also was not 100% a happy time for me. I was a girl from a small town in Kansas with a very rural, old-fashioned family. I'd grown up without watching TV, and it was a kind of a crash, really, into a culture that was both vibrant and exciting and overwhelming. And I write in the book about how it was such a both-and experience for me. Both I was loving and enjoying the experience, and I felt very guilty because my father had had a stroke, and I left my mother to work and support the family and take care of my father and my younger sisters. And so it was a mix of elation and regret. And I have a story in there called Dock of the Bay about going down and looking at the moonlight and hoping to find light that would cheer me up and would put me on a path of resilience. And that particular night, I couldn't find it. It's the only story in the book I write where I just could not find that silver thread of resilience to carry my life forward. But after that, I traveled some. I wasn't ready to enter the world of work. In fact, when I discovered the world of work, office work, I was shocked by it. It never occurred to me that all this preparation I'd done and all the college and all the kinds of work I'd done being a waitress were actually much more fun than the kind of work most people have to do the rest of their lives, 40 hours a week. And I lasted in an office job 1 week and decided I wasn't ready for that world of work. And I never have become ready for that world of work. I've stayed away from it.
I so particularly enjoyed one well, many things, but this one quote from your book, you're just talking about the importance of light. And you say that from an early age, you were a solar powered person, and
Yeah.
that you mean that very seriously. And a little bit later, you explain it, and I want to quote this because I love it so much. Um, I cannot stay long in a room without a window. I would rather shovel horse manure outside than work in a cubicle or in the back room of a store.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of says it all
Yeah.
about how not just pleasant it is for you to be outdoors, but really necessary to your spirit.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Um, I want to say, first of all, if you're just tuning in, I'm talking to Mary Pipher, who is the author most recently of the memoir, A Life in Light, Meditations on Impermanence. So, Mary, I wanted to ask you just a couple questions about the process of writing a memoir.
Yes.
It's so different from your other books. And I happen to be currently writing a memoir myself now, and I experience it as both deeply rewarding and sometimes quite harrowing because
Mm-hmm.
we have to go back to our childhoods and the scene of the crime, or at least difficult experiences. So I'm wondering, as you wrote your book, was there anything or just one or two things that you found particularly challenging to revisit and write about?
Yes. Well, I found it challenging to write about the late 60s because it was, I knew several people who killed themselves and lost themselves to drugs. My father was very ill. My younger siblings struggled quite a lot during this period of time, and their lives were very marked by their time in the 60s, more marked than mine, I might add. But the other thing that I really struggled with was the fact that my dad was a very traumatized man. He had been a medic in Okinawa in the Philippines and on Peleliu and had a terrible time in World War II. And then he'd gone on to fight in the Korean War and had a very bad time in that war. And he wasn't under control. He wasn't a controlled person. He came back from the wars and drank a lot and had an enormous amount of anger, never talked about the wars, explosive temperament, abusive, and sometimes emotionally very difficult to live with. I tell a story about his chiding me that I will never be pretty enough to marry and that I need to become a doctor so that I could support myself because I'll be on my own my whole life. And at that time, I was 12 or 13, and I was a pretty enough girl. I wasn't a knockout, but I certainly wasn't so ugly no one would ever marry me. Proof of that is I've been married now a long, long time. So at least one person wanted to marry me. But on the other hand, I loved my dad, and I had a lot of empathic feelings toward him. And I think from the early on in my life, I tried very hard to understand my parents. Neither one of them was a particularly good parent, but I loved them. I loved them as people. I needed to believe they loved me, and they did love me. That's not just a fantasy on my part. They did love me very much. And so when I went back and struggled with some of the stories about my father, um, and also about my mother, really, I was caught up in this strange feeling of both realizing they had let us children down, and yet instead of feeling anger for them, I felt a strange kind of a sympathy and empathy with them, and I struggled to figure out how to even write about my feelings. I actually, with my mother, I've really come to some terms with her. She was very bright. She was a very good person. She was on the autism spectrum, and she worked all the time. But otherwise, she was a very good mother when she was around. And I can accept that. I can accept that. And I loved her very much. My father, I never have been able to quite put all those pieces together and understand him fully, or figure out how to feel towards someone who on one hand I think loved us children, and on the other hand was a pretty brutal father. So that was probably the hardest part of the book for me. Um, I'm graced with a extremely good memory, emotional memory. I can't remember an enormous number of things, but I can remember emotional moments in my life. And I can remember very particular details about interactions. I mean, I think that's why I became a psychologist. That's the stuff that is very vivid to me in my life, and what I pay attention to, as opposed to, say, what people wear, or um, what kind of artwork they have in their home. I pay attention to their faces and their gestures, their emotional tone. So that part of it was really fun. And it was really fun to remember. I write quite a bit in this book about all the women in my life that have saved me, whether it was my first girlfriend in junior high, close girlfriend I could really talk to, or whether it was my aunts, or my long walks with my mother at sunset, and my grandparents, and then women friends. I've just been very lucky all my life to have these wonderful, nurturing women friends. And the thing about women friends that's so special to me is most women, including me, do a lot of caretaking. Especially if you're a therapist, that's your life, doing caretaking. But women friends take care of me. And that's just a beautiful gift in my life.
I imagine it's mutual.
Yeah, thank you. I think it is. That's what friends are, mutual. Yeah.
Right. Just reminds me, this is a passing thought, that Joan Didion once said, "I write to find out what I'm thinking." Mm-hmm. And it sounds as though that was part of the process for you too, especially touching on these emotional memories that then lead you back into these worlds. So before we go, I want to just not skip over the important subtitle of your book, which is Meditations on Impermanence. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about why you chose that subtitle and what that means to you.
Well, first of all, I think that, especially as I age, but really all my life, I've been very aware of time passing and how precious moments were. I figured out very young how to store good moments, because I knew they were moments, they'd be gone. And I figured out a way to really absorb every bit of information I could from my senses with a good moment, and then chunk it in my memory so that I have it. And that's been a real gift. I can remember in great detail small things. But the other thing about time is, I think happiness basically consists of accepting the passage of time. Life isn't terrible, life isn't wonderful, life isn't permanent. And it's constantly oscillating between terrible and wonderful. And America's changed so much since I was a girl. The technology's changed. And my own experience of life is, perhaps because of my distant parents, I was an attaching organism. When I met people I liked, I just made myself the most lovable, interesting person I could possibly make myself to be. And I've had a life of attaching, whether it's to friends, professional friends, family. I'm very close to my cousins, old cousins down in the Ozarks. And I'm close to my brothers and my children, my grandchildren, long-term friends. I've lived in the same town over 50 years now. But I'm realizing as I age that the last decade or so of my life are really going to be about learning to detach. And so I write about that quite a bit in the book, that friends start to die, families start to die. These lovely grandchildren that I was so involved with, 5 of them, some have moved to Canada, some have had the nerve to grow up, but they're not with me anymore. And so I think that the great ending lesson of the book is learning to find light in my own heart and learning to give myself some of the nurturance and companionship that I've always sought in other people. And the pandemic was a great lesson on that. If we were going to be happy during the pandemic, we had to find ways to sustain ourselves alone as a person. And I feel like I'm a meditator. I'm very interested in mindfulness. And of course, mindfulness is all about knowing that every moment is different and everything changes every moment. So I wrote a lot about change in this book.
Yes, you did. Yeah. And I think from a therapist-client point of view, but I guess from any of us in any relationship, it's so important to know, but also to support people in understanding that everything does change, so that also when we are really down, far down, we can understand, know that it will change. I think that's so crucial. And I'm very grateful that you wrote this book so that we can meditate on that. And so we've been talking to Mary Pipher, and to remind people, she's the author of a new memoir called A Life in Light, Meditations on Impermanence. Thank you, Mary, so much. It's been such a pleasure to be with you.
I've enjoyed it also. I hope we can do this again sometime.